Well, time to do this again. Episode 2 of HBO's House of the Dragon was Sunday, and it was, like the first episode, a mixed bag. Because so much of what I have to say about the second episode ties directly into what I had to say about the first review, I want to go over my concerns from that first episode in order of importance based on what I saw in episode 2. My biggest concern going into the second episode was the performance of Millie Alcock as Princess Rhaenyra. It was such a concern that I made her an entirely separate section in the review. Next would be the hard-handed feminist agenda being pushed through some of the promotional efforts by HBO, interviews by cast members in recent weeks, and certain scenes in the first episode. Race, which I thought might become an issue if overplayed, given how George R.R. Martin wrote his Game of Thrones world, also made an appearance on my list. And finally, the appalling CGI used for Princess Rhaenyra's dragon, Syrax. As with last episode's review, I'm going to try and keep this down to very mild spoilers at most. Unlike the previous review, where I broke it up into good and bad, I'm just going to go in the order of issues that occurred to me as the show progressed. I have to say, my concerns over Millie Alcock were somewhat allayed in episode 2. Those glimpses she showed of the talent that got her the role were finally let out to play in this episode. She was less a sociopath and more the daughter of a king and an heir trying to gain her footing in the new world she found herself in as a person one breath away from the Iron Throne. She was tentative and inventive, and the affectless performance of last week was gone. I found her the most improved aspect of the show over the first episode. I loved her confrontation with Daemon, and her performance at the end of the episode couldn't have been better. The last two scenes with the king were excellent. As with the first episode, the scenes with Viserys and Alicent kept up the creep factor, even as they were both well acted. The previous episode hinted at it, and my last review mentioned it, especially since Alicent is only supposed to be 14 in the show, rather than the 20 or so she would be if they stuck with George R.R. Martin's writing in Fire and Blood. Adding to the creep factor was the scene between the king and Lord Corlys's eldest daughter, though Paddy Considine was simply perfect as Viserys. He has the weak ruler thing down pat. History is replete with monarchs such as Viserys, and the results are almost always very Game of Thronesy. And with any good weak ruler scenario, there's usually a slimy politician in the background trying to arrange things for himself. Rhys Ifans is the very picture of the whispering advisor guiding the king, not in a direction he would normally go, but in a direction that will benefit said advisor. I would say Ifans could have a career as a politician, his weasel game is so good, but nobody who saw House of the Dragon would trust him enough to vote for him, which I guess is exactly what he was going for with the performance. I said in the first episode review that Steve Toussaint as Lord Corlys Velaryon was a concern. Not only was he a concern because they were trying to remake Westeros to look more like California and less like Martin's Westeros, but I felt the writers and the showrunners were trying to tokenize characters without using any kind of creativity to simply include such characters organically. Episode 2 did not allay that fear. What it did do was make me think that Steve Toussaint is being wasted on this show. His is a performance that seems to be lacking the writing it deserves. It got slightly better at the end of the episode, but the writing up to that end scene left me mainly wanting to fix it. If his character is going to remain prominent, it has to get better. If they are going to morph him into what he was in the book following this episode, a lord who stays in his own domain and eschews court politics, which I doubt, then he becomes an even more tokenized figure and his talent even more wasted. One of the more disappointing points in the premiere, for me at least, was the god-awful CGI. The opening scene where Rhaenyra lands her dragon in the courtroom had me aghast at its dreadfulness. Now, the second episode was infinitely better, but that is only saying so much given where we started with the series. It almost looked like the CGI for the second episode was what they meant all along, and somebody, multiple somebodies, let the rough draft version slip through. Cyrax, Rhaenyra's dragon, was practically a completely different creature from that courtyard scene. Better, but still not what one would expect from a Game of Thrones show. I did a follow-up video to my first review that talked about an article that came out concerning an interview Millie Alcock, who plays Princess Rhaenyra, and Emily Carey, who plays Alicent Hightower, gave to a few outlets that included Insider. In it, I said they're hinting at the relationship between the two girls as being more than a little lesbian in nature was simply stupid, given how their characters in the book and the way the story winds up. Well, without spoiling things, let me just go ahead and pat myself on the back for that call. One of these days, studios will start reining in their actors, writers, directors, showrunners, etc. when it comes to running their mouths to the media. All that interview did was warn a lot of prospective viewers, the people who actually help pay the bills for Warner Brothers, that this show was agenda-driven rather than story-driven. It did nothing to increase viewership, bring in subscribers, or increase the interest of people who had decided not to watch the show after seeing the advertising in the run-up to the premiere, especially given how things are going to play out between the two characters. Activists are the second biggest problem Hollywood has at the moment, and this was a perfect example of that in action. House of the Dragon is not the greatest show I've ever seen, despite what some of the shill media would have you believe. After all, these are the same lunatics that are lapping up all the Rings of Power promos like pigs at a slop trough. It remains entertaining, but as I suggested in the first review, the real-world political agenda is becoming more prevalent. Eve Best's character made her presence known in that aspect in this episode, but it actually made Millie Alcock look better in comparison. It is still maintaining itself at the annoying and slightly jarring but not too much level. That is not to say if it gets any more heavy-handed that it will not begin to drive away viewers, because it will. This show is simply not good enough to withstand the preaching by elitist actors and writers. The saddest thing I came away with from this week's episode was the feeling that the characters that work best and are acted the best are often the most neglected and least explored. It is almost as if this show would have been better if they started it a few years back in the story to build the tension, develop characters, and introduce the land to those who did not watch Game of Thrones and definitely won't go back and do so because Season 8 was such a massively public disaster. The biggest example of that was the more prominent role of Sonoya Mizuno, who plays Mysaria in the story. I noticed her in the first episode, but did not mention her because she was in one scene and had barely any impact on the story. Her part in this episode was bigger, but it merely made me wish there was more to her. There are a number of characters like that, which had me musing on the story written for the show and if the writers are competent enough to pull this off. The only comfort I have in that respect is that they have a completed book by the author, though that is only comforting until they run out of material as Game of Thrones did. Just as George R.R. Martin will likely never finish Winds of Winter, he likely will never finish the second volume of the Fire and Blood series that is the basis of House of the Dragon. I hate to leave this on such a downer, but thanks for watching. If you like what I do here, like, subscribe, comment, and share this video to help me out with the algorithm. My links for social media and Patreon are in the description, and I will be back next week with episode 3.